Hello, Bobs. We're back with Triad, a novel of the supernatural by Mary Leader. We've just discovered that Dr. Ambrose was kissing her while she was under hypnosis. And it's kind of creepy, but there we go. 20, chapter 20. The weather turned warm during the night, and along with the thaw came rain, then a perverse plunge of the thermometer by morning, which turned the rain to sleet. And by the time I got up, the world outside was ablaze with diamonds. Each branch, each minuscule twig was weighted down in gelid, ruthless splendor. Mrs. Lemke and I attacked the evergreens and some of the more fragile trees with brooms, knocking away the ice that threatened to break their limbs. The willows we left alone, knowing their supple branches would endure their burden, and they stood there motionless, great showers of crystal, crackling and snapping as long prisms broke away and shattered on the frozen snow. Lance attempted to climb the frozen drifts like the knight up the glass hill, but he either slid back down on his haunches or broke through the sharp, jagged crust. Betrayed by his beloved snow, he was as willing as we were to return to the house. It was a day to be contented inside, and Mrs. Lemke remarked on that several times. Perhaps she had a presentiment that something might rob her of her cozy security, but it was I who knew something was wrong when the phone rang. Afraid something might have happened to Alan, I answered, but it was a man's voice asking for Mrs. Lemke. I handed her the phone, and I saw her round cheeks go pinched and drawn. It was an army chaplain calling. Her son Harold had been badly injured in a Jeep accident and might not live. We had a long and treacherous drive to and from the airport over slippery roads that sent us into a spin several times. By the time we reached home, my arms were aching from gripping the wheel. I carried David into the house, fed him, and put him in his crib. I was so exhausted I didn't bother to make supper, just nibbled on some crackers and went to bed. Mrs. Lemke would be well on her way now, winging through the night. She'd always said she'd never fly. I could see her sitting upright in the plane, her worn hands tightly clenched, wondering if she'd get there in time. Poor Mrs. Lemke, a widow, and now her only son. The bed was so temptingly comfortable. Phoebe stood by the telephone downstairs, holding the slip of paper Dr. Ambrose had given me. I looked down at her from where I floated, remote and disembodied. She's won, I thought, to myself in a curiously detached mood. She's taken my body, and I can't get back. Now I know how she felt all along. Nor did it seem strange that I was seeing her at last. Now she couldn't see me. She dialed nervously, getting the wrong number at first, and finally speaking into the phone in a half whisper. "Doctor," her voice trembled. "It's Phoebe. I found the scars, and I know who she is. You've got to come right away." She listened to his reply, all the while turning and looking over her shoulder as if someone were after her. Did she sense me hovering there? But I meant her no harm. Yes, her voice was urgent. "She's the one, all right, and I'm so frightened. No, Mrs. Lemke isn't here. Her son was hurt in an accident. It's as if she wanted her out of the house. Come quick. Oh, come quick. I don't know how long I can hold out against her. I've tried to break away, but she's stronger than ever." She hung up the telephone and started up the stairs. I tried to call to her and reassure her, but she paid no heed. She just kept running up the stairs into the clouds, from which the flights emerged, not as stairs, but a great glass tower slowly turning, and a rose-colored bird was beating its wings against one of the windows until they became bloodied and broken. Yet somehow she managed to stay aloft until a black form darted out of the mist and struck her again and again. Stop it, I cried, but I had no tongue, and the torment continued until the ruby bird crumbled and fell, over and over, down into the clouds. Only they weren't clouds, they were a vast field of flowers where a white horse was grazing. It lifted its head and neighed as a gray steed approached. Astride was Dr. Ambrose, wearing a high, conical hat and long flowing black robes embroidered with silver crescents and pentacles. Then I saw Phoebe standing on a small rise, wearing a diaphanous white kirtle with a heavily embroidered green and gold girdle at her waist. Three birds circled, singing above her. The doctor dismounted and started toward her, his face grim and set with purpose. But as she stood there holding her arms out to him, the breeze ruffling the gossamer about her body, I saw his jaw go slack, the sweat stand out on his brow, and his eyes glazed with desire. He reached for her, but in that instant she sprang to the back of the white mare and was off into the sunset. He set off in pursuit, but no matter how cruelly he spurred his steed, he kept falling farther behind. Hers moved so fast that horse and rider now glowed red with the friction of their passage, and a pack of white hounds with blood-red ears were sprinting alongside them. Ahead lay a black-green forest into which she and the hounds disappeared. "Phoebe, Ninian," he called, "wait for me," but his voice was lost in the baying of the pack. Then I saw her rein in before a cave that was half hidden in the underbrush. Slowly she circled her mount Widdershins again and again, obviously wanting the doctor to narrow the gap between them. The animal was now black as a burned-out cinder. So was her robe, but her hair flowed silver down it. And I knew her for who she really was. If only I could stop him, grab hold of the bridle, and turn his horse. But I had no substance. At last she dismounted, tossed the reins over a spike on a low-hanging branch of a giant hawthorn, and followed the hounds into the cavern. She glided effortlessly along the passage, even though the ground was strewn with glass-sharp rocks. Above, the ceiling was hung with icicles, and the gray forms of sleeping bats. I could hear Dr. Ambrose stumbling over the jagged stones, his breathing labored and his feet leaving blood behind them. Every once in a while he would stop and listen for her footfalls, but she had disappeared behind a tall crystal column that marked the entrance into a large chamber, in the center of which lay a subterranean pool. One after the other, the hounds dived into the murky water, barely rippling its surface, until the last one vanished, and the pool lay once more silent. His robe torn and flapping loosely, Dr. Ambrose entered the chamber, still calling for her. His dark eyes swept its dim recesses, but there was nothing to be seen but the glistening rock formations. In the half-light, then a whir of wings and the flashing of talons and a hooked beak with laughter screeching, and the doctor was standing there with blood pouring from empty eye sockets. Yet he was strangely smiling. "I've been so blind," his voice echoed, "but now I see. I know you now. I know you from all those other times. Branwen, what have you done to her? Must it always be the same?" I tried to call to him, but it was useless. With arms outstretched, he staggered to the pool and knelt down, plunging his hands into its inky waters, as though he hoped to drag me from its depths. She came stealing up behind him, a heavy splinter of ice in her hands. I wanted to reach out and snatch it from her, but I had no hands. Those were my hands holding the icicle. He never turned nor heard it descend, and he did not cry out as he disappeared into the black water. The only sound was the shrill call of a falcon as it fled through the shadows. The raven darted after it, but it escaped deep into the cavern, winging its way towards some distant light. She stood at the pool's edge, staring at the water as bubbles rose to the surface, then burst and flattened out into concentric circles. Her silver hair hung down in icy strands, and the black gloss of the waters reflected on her face. With a swift motion of her hands, a huge slab broke off from the side of the cave and fell with a crash over the pool. The stone was smooth and white, like the lid of a freezer. Then she turned to me for the first time, her eyes glittering, green in their blue lids, her skin drawn tight over skeletal cheekbones. And suddenly I returned to my body, finding it vulnerable and a hindrance as I fled up the winding stairs which led out of the cave, she pursuing me, trying to pull me back. Up and up we went, straight out of hell, and into the house again, only it had endless flights and floors that turned on an axis around which the staircase wound. Somewhere David was sleeping. No, he was crying in my arms that I had to protect him. On and on I climbed, feeling her arms twining around us. the vice-like grip of her talons, her foul breath wheezing into my neck. At last we were out on the widow's walk, and her hand was on my mouth as she tried to force me over the rail. Clasping the baby to me with one hand and clinging desperately to the railing with the other, I looked down the dizzying heights into the lake where no bottom existed, and the hawthorns extended their thorns. But the alder rose from the side of the house and coiled one wiry branch around her throat, forcing her to release me. Her knuckles whitened on the alder as she struggled with it, but the coils only drew tighter, and then she was limp in its grasp. Her eyes gone moist, her cheeks flushed once more with innocence, her lips parted as though praying for forgiveness. So lovely and forlorn, a wounded animal, so potent in her weakness, I had to grant her anything she wanted, even David. Slowly I lifted him and held him out to her. She slid out of the alder's toils and came toward us, reaching for him a little too quickly, too greedily. My eyes took the measure of the hunger in her eyes. Now the hounds came again, rushing for the stairs, but Lance was there first. Slashing and ripping their throats, I thrust David into a corner and turned to meet her. This time the strength was in me, pouring into me as the clouds slipped away from a full moon from which perpendicular rays blazed across the sky. With a supreme effort, I shook her off, and she hissed away into nothing as the altar changed into Alan. He picked up the baby, and we stood there, the lake no longer rooted in hell, but stretching before us in endless union with the blue vault overhead. I woke up to the sound of David crying for his feeding. The moon had broken through the clouds and was shining in my window, its rays forming a cross on the glass. Spooky dreams. As we reach the last 9 pages. Goodbye, bruv. Good boy.